The desert never forgot. It kept every scream, every whisper, every tear the wind couldn't carry away. That morning the sun rose over Silver Creek Valley like a blade drawn from fire. Heat shimmered across the dunes even before noon. In the hollow of a dried riverbed, 5 Apache women lay scattered among the stones, bruised, barefoot, and silent. Their clothes were torn, their wrists marked by ropes. Flies buzzed around them like the desert's cruel laughter. The oldest of them, Naira, stirred first. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. She tried to move, but pain screamed through her ribs. Around her, Lozen and Sahana lay still, dust clinging to their faces. Ahioka, the youngest, muttered something in her native tongue, a prayer half forgotten. Naira looked up to the endless sky, voice barely a breath. "Please, let me stay tonight," she whispered. "Just one more night." They had run for 3 days since the traders burned their village, chased by men who thought flesh could be sold like cattle. When the horses collapsed, the men took what they wanted, then rode away laughing. The desert had finished what they started. By the time the wind changed, only the desperate were left breathing. From beyond the ridge came the faint sound of hooves. A horse. Slow, heavy, deliberate. A shadow appeared through the veil of dust, a tall man in a wide-brim hat, his coat faded by sun and years. Caleb Morton, rancher, widower, and the last soul still living on the dead land of Silver Creek. He reined in his horse when he saw them. For a long moment, he didn't move. He'd seen bodies before, soldiers, settlers, men who'd thought the desert could be conquered. But these were women. Young, broken, alive, maybe. Caleb dismounted, his boots sinking into the sand. He crouched beside Naira, uncapped his canteen, and pressed it to her lips. "Easy now," he muttered. Small sips. Water spilled down her chin. She drank like someone remembering what mercy tasted like. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his gray eyes under the shadow of a dusty hat. "Are you gonna hurt us?" she asked. He shook his head once. "No, ma'am." Behind him, the wind carried the distant cry of coyotes. The sun climbed higher, merciless. Caleb glanced at the sky, then at the women. He couldn't leave them. Not here. With a quiet sigh, he stood, wiped the sweat from his brow, and said, "Get up if you can. My wagon's half a mile west. Ain't much, but it's dry." Naira tried to rise. Her legs trembled, but Lozen helped her. One by one, they followed 5 ghosts walking through heat and dust behind a man who didn't yet know why he'd stopped for them. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of cedar smoke from somewhere far ahead, the faint promise of shelter. Caleb looked back once, at the faces behind him, and whispered to himself, "Lord, what am I getting myself into this time?" Then he led them toward the horizon. And for the first time in years, the desert saw 6 shadows moving together toward life. The wagon creaked over the cracked earth, wheels sinking into sand as the heat thickened around them. Caleb Morton held the reins in silence, his hat pulled low, the lines on his face etched deep as the canyons themselves. The 5 women sat in the back, wrapped in tattered blankets he'd found under the seat. They didn't speak much, only the soft rattle of breath and the low groan of the wheels broke the quiet. Naira watched the back of the man who'd found them, her eyes wary. He hadn't asked names. He hadn't asked what happened. Just water, a nod, and that rough voice saying, "You're coming with me." When the wagon crossed into Silver Creek Ranch, the sun was sliding behind the red cliffs. The place looked forgotten by God, a half-collapsed barn, fences leaning like drunks, the windmill turning slow, squeaking in protest. The old house stood at the center, wood faded gray and windows boarded from storms long past. Caleb pulled the horse to a stop. "Ain't much," he said flatly, "but it's shelter." He climbed down, pain flickering in his leg, where an old wound still ached. One by one, he lifted them from the wagon. Lozen first, her hand trembling. Then Sahana, who carried the calm of someone who'd already lost too much to fear anything more. Ahioka tried to thank him in broken English. "We work? You let us stay?" Caleb met her eyes for a moment. "Eat first, work later." Inside, the house smelled of dust and wood smoke long gone. He opened the shutters, letting in a sliver of dying light. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet. In the corner, a portrait hung crooked, a woman holding a baby, faces dulled by sun and time. Naira saw him glance toward it. Something heavy crossed his face before he turned away. "Sit by the stove," he said, pouring water into a rusted pot. "Soup's all I can offer tonight." The women huddled close as he lit the fire. For the first time in months, warmth touched their skin without fear. As the broth simmered, Caleb stood by the doorway, watching the horizon fade into night. The air smelled of sage and rain, strange company for ghosts. Behind him, Naira whispered to the others in Apache, "He lost someone here." They nodded, sensing it too, the weight in the way he moved, the silence he wore like armor. When he finally sat and handed them tin bowls, his voice was quiet, distant. "You'll stay here till you're strong enough to walk," he said. "After that, we'll see." Naira met his gaze across the firelight. "Why you help us?" Caleb looked down, stirring his soup. "Because once," he said slowly, "no one helped her. No one asked who her was." The answer already lived in the house. Outside, the coyotes howled, a warning to the dark that something human had returned to this land. And for the first time in a decade, light burned again in the windows of Silver Creek Ranch. The night came slow over Silver Creek Ranch, heavy with wind and the smell of dry earth. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked weakly, throwing long shadows across the walls, the kind of shadows that made a man remember what he'd tried to forget. Caleb sat by the hearth, mending a broken strap with steady, tired hands. Behind him, the 5 Apache women lay close together on the wooden floor, wrapped in blankets that once belonged to his late wife. Their breathing was shallow, but it was breathing a sound the house hadn't known in years. He looked at them without turning his head, eyes half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Every detail felt like a ghost's hand on his shoulder, the sound of cloth rustling, the smell of broth still lingering in the air, the flicker of life where there had been only silence. He rose quietly, stepping outside for air. The wind met him cold, brushing through the mesquite trees that lined the fence. Beyond the fields, the land stretched endless and bare, just like the years he'd spent alone. His wife, Eleanor, had died right there in that house. The doctor never made it through the storm. Since then, Caleb had lived with nothing but horses, dust, and guilt that refused to die. Now, by some cruel mercy, fate had sent 5 strangers into that emptiness. He turned when he heard a sound, soft footsteps behind him. Naira stood at the doorway, blanket draped over her shoulders, hair tangled by wind. "You should rest," he said gruffly. Her voice was quiet, trembling. "We don't mean trouble." He nodded once. "Didn't say you did." She hesitated, then added, "Back in my tribe, when a man takes in the lost, he becomes their keeper." Caleb's mouth tightened. "Don't know about tribes. I just couldn't leave you for the coyotes." She studied him for a moment. The firelight from inside touched the edge of his jaw, lined, scarred, but human. "You lost someone," she said softly. Caleb didn't answer. He turned to face the horizon instead. The stars were sharp tonight, cold as truth. "Go back inside," he murmured. "You'll need strength come morning." Naira obeyed, stepping back into the dim glow. For a moment, she looked around the room, the old cradle by the wall, the faded photograph, the half-fixed saddle. Everything carried memory. Everything carried grief. The other women stirred in their sleep. Lozen murmured a prayer. Ahioka clutched her sister's hand. Outside, Caleb stood alone until the chill bit through his coat. When he finally came in, he added one more log to the fire and sat in the corner, rifle across his lap. He would not sleep tonight. In the stillness, Naira whispered, without opening her eyes, "Thank you for not walking away." Caleb said nothing, but in the hush between heartbeats, the ghost seemed to fade just a little, as if even they understood that, for the first time in years, someone had chosen to stay. Morning crept over Silver Creek Ranch, slow and pale, like a bruise healing under sunlight. The fire had burned low, leaving only a handful of glowing coals. The women stirred beneath their blankets, every movement stiff with the memory of pain. Caleb Morton was already outside, chopping kindling by the corral. His breath fogged in the cool air, shirt damp with sweat. For years, he'd done this for no one but himself now. Every swing of the axe felt like proof he wasn't alone anymore. though he wasn't sure he wanted to believe it. When he came back in, Naira was crouched by the stove, coaxing the coals back to life. She looked up, wary but steady. "Fire was dying," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "You did right." He handed her a bucket of water. "Boil it. We'll clean those cuts today." The others rose one by one. Lozen, tall and sharp-eyed, found a broom and began sweeping. Sahana folded the blankets, humming something in her own tongue. Ahyoka limped to the doorway, blinking against the morning light, while Tiva, the quietest, scrubbed the tin bowls until they shone. Caleb watched them a while. They moved slow, cautious, but there was rhythm in it, the rhythm of people remembering how to live. "You can stay here," he said finally, voice low but firm. "But everyone works. This ain't charity." Lozen looked up, chin high. "We don't need charity." Something almost like a smile flickered in his beard. "Didn't figure you did." The day passed with the kind of silence that wasn't empty. They patched the roof with old boards. They carried water from the creek. The sound of women's voices began to drift through the yard, soft and uncertain, like birds testing their wings after a storm. Near sundown, Caleb repaired the fence by the barn while the women cooked. The smell of beans and corn filled the air. He stood a long moment watching the smoke curl upward, remembering when Eleanor used to sing there before fever took her and the child both. When Naira called him for supper, he hesitated on the porch. The sound of laughter inside hit him like a gust of warm air through an open door. He hadn't heard laughter in this house since the night before the world ended. He stepped in quietly. 5 pairs of dark eyes looked up from the table. The firelight painted them gold. Naira slid a bowl toward him. "You built the fire," she said. "You eat with us." Saturday, no one spoke for a while. Just the scrape of spoons and the crackle of logs. Outside, the desert wind carried dust across the valley, but inside that old ranch house for the first time in 10 long years the night didn't feel so big. And when Caleb glanced at the window, he could have sworn the reflection staring back wasn't a ghost anymore. Night came down gentle, folding over Silver Creek Ranch like a wool blanket. The air outside smelled of sage and wood smoke. Inside, the fire cast a steady orange glow across the worn walls. The sound of spoons scraping against tin bowls was the only thing that moved between them for a while. When the food was gone, the quiet stayed. The kind of quiet that had weight. Caleb sat by the stove, oiling his old Winchester, pretending not to listen as the women spoke in hushed voices behind him. The words were soft and Apache, but sorrow needed no translation. Finally, Naira's voice rose clear, slow, and deliberate. "Our village was near the Pecos," she said, switching to English. "Soldiers came last winter, said we were stealing cattle. They burned everything. My husband, he was inside the hut when the fire spread." No one interrupted. The logs cracked softly, sending up a spark that floated and died before it reached the chimney. Lozen spoke next, her tone low and steady. "I fought. Took a rifle from one of them. Shot till they stopped coming. But war don't feed the living." She looked at her hands. "Only makes more graves." Sahana, older and rounder, added, "I had 2 boys. They didn't make it across the mountains." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, but she didn't look away. Tiva whispered, "We thought we could work for the traders. Earn enough to start again." Ahyoka shook her head. "They lied. They always lie." Caleb set the rifle aside, his jaw tight. He had heard versions of this story before from soldiers, ranchers, settlers, but never like this. Never from the ones who survived. Naira looked at him then. "And you? Caleb Morton? Who did you lose?" He stared at the flames for a long time. The orange light danced over his weathered face, filling the cracks that life had carved deep. "My wife, Eleanor," he said quietly, "and a son that never took a breath." The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Naira's voice softened. "That's why the house feels sad." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I suppose it remembers better than I do." Sahana reached over the table, placing her calloused hand near his. "Maybe sadness don't need to end," she said. "Maybe it just needs company." Caleb looked at her, then at the others, 5 women who'd seen hell and still found enough faith to sit and share warmth. He nodded once. "Then I guess this house has company tonight." The fire burned steady, throwing light against the old portrait on the wall, Eleanor holding her child. For the first time, it didn't look like a gravestone. Outside, coyotes howled somewhere beyond the ridge, but their cries felt distant now, small against the laughter that followed when Ioka spilled a little water and cursed softly in two languages. Caleb smiled without meaning to. The sound startled him, a sound he hadn't made in 10 years. And for that one quiet night, Silver Creek Ranch didn't belong to ghosts anymore. It belonged to the living. By the sixth day, the women could stand on their own. The bruises had turned yellow, and their hands, though still raw, no longer trembled. When they worked, the ranch, once silent as a grave, had begun to sound like life again. A broom sweeping across the porch, the thud of a hammer fixing the barn door, a faint hum of a song carried on the wind. But the supplies were running thin. Caleb Morton stood by the corral, running a hand along the horse's neck, thinking. The flour barrel was nearly empty, and there wasn't enough coffee to last another sunrise. The town of Drywells was 20 miles south, far enough that gossip could cool, but close enough that trouble could still find its way back. When Naira approached, he didn't have to turn to know it was her. She moved with quiet confidence now, her bare feet soft against the dust. "You go to town?" she asked. He nodded. "Got the rest stock? Coffee, salt, bullets." "I come," she said. He frowned. "Ain't safe. They don't take kindly to Apache folk." Naira's chin lifted. "They didn't take kindly before either. We're still here." Lozen stepped forward from the barn, a strip of leather in her hand. "I'll go too," she said. "Someone has to carry the bags." Caleb studied them both, two women with eyes that didn't bend easy, then sighed. "Fine, but you stay close. Don't talk unless you have to." They rode into Drywells near midday, the sun sitting high and merciless. Dust curled around the wagon wheels as they entered the main street, a crooked line of saloons, a blacksmith, and a general store with peeling paint. People stopped what they were doing when they saw them. A rancher leading two Apache women? That was enough to make tongues wag for weeks. Caleb ignored the stares. He tied the horse outside the store and handed Naira a short list written on torn paper. Flour, coffee, soap, nothing else. Inside, the store smelled of kerosene and tobacco. The clerk, a thin man with a red beard, looked up and froze. "We don't trade with—" Caleb cut him off. "You trade with money, don't you?" He placed 3 silver coins on the counter. "Then we're trading." The man hesitated, eyes darting between Caleb and the women. Naira stood tall beside the shelves, silent but unyielding. Lozen's hand hovered near her belt knife just in case. While the clerk packed the supplies, the saloon doors across the street swung open. A voice, rough and too familiar, drifted through the dust. "Well, I'll be damned. Brent Holloway." He stepped out, a whiskey bottle in one hand, a smirk crawling across his scarred face. "Didn't think you'd crawl this far, girl." His eyes locked on Naira, sliding down her figure like poison. "You found yourself a new master, huh?" Caleb stiffened. His hand twitched near the holster, but he didn't draw. "Not yet." "You stole my property, Morton." Brent spat, staggering closer. 5 of them. Cost me good money." Naira's voice trembled with fury. "We are not property." Brent laughed. "Out here, girl, everything's property if someone wants it bad enough." A few townsfolk gathered, whispering. The sheriff wasn't in sight. He rarely was when trouble started. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low. "You best walk away, Brent." Brent sneered. "You got no proof of nothing, old man." Lozen took a step closer, eyes sharp as flint. "I got proof," she said coldly. "It's called the scars on our backs." Brent's smile faltered, but he recovered quick, spitting on the ground. Big words for savages hiding behind a tired cowboy. Before anyone could blink, he swung a backhand toward Naira. She flinched, but the blow never landed. Caleb caught Brent's wrist midair. His grip was iron, unmoving. "That's enough." The street went dead quiet. Even the wind stopped. Brent's face twisted as he tried to pull free, but Caleb didn't budge. Then, from behind, boots crunched against gravel. The sheriff finally appeared, hat low over his eyes. "Let him go, Morton." Caleb's jaw clenched. He released Brent slowly, deliberately. The sheriff looked from one face to another, sighed. and said, "No more fighting in my town. You hear me?" Brent laughed, brushing off his sleeve. "You hear that, old man? Keep your strays at home." He turned away, but his eyes burned with something that promised this wasn't finished. They rode back to Silver Creek as the sun began to fall, the wagon heavy with supplies but heavier with silence. Naira sat stiff beside Caleb, her hands clenched around the list. After a long while, she whispered, "He'll come again." Caleb didn't look at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon he will." The road stretched endless ahead of them, painted gold by the dying Sunday. Behind, dust rose where hooves had been, and somewhere out there, a man named Brent Holloway was already thinking about how to reclaim what he thought was his. For now, though, Silver Creek Ranch waited, and the storm was coming home. The wind changed that night. It came from the north, colder than it should have been for late summer, sliding through the gaps in the old barn like a whisper of warning. Caleb Morton felt at first that quiet tightening in the chest that only comes when a man knows something bad is on its way. He was in the yard, checking the horses before turning in. The sky above Silver Creek Valley was a deep violet, the stars dimmed behind thin clouds of dust. The lantern flickered in his hand, throwing yellow light over the fence. Beyond it, the desert stretched black and still. Inside the house, the women were sewing by lamplight. Through the window, Caleb could see their silhouettes, 5 shadows moving gently, steady as breathing. He caught himself watching longer than he meant to. A month ago, this house had been silent as a tomb. Now it had warmth, sound, life. Maybe that's why he noticed so quickly when the quiet changed. A horse snorted near the corral. Then came a creak faint, wrong like a gate touched by the wind, but heavier. Caleb set the lantern down, the flame quivering as if it knew too. He moved slow, careful, his boots barely stirring the dirt. His eyes swept the dark horizon. Nothing moved. Nothing, until a flash of steel caught the moonlight. A knife. 2 figures crouched by the fence, another a few paces behind 3 men. One carried a rifle, another a rope. Caleb's voice came out low. "Lozen," he called softly without turning. She was already there, silent as the desert itself, her shadow forming beside the barn door. "I see them," she whispered. 3. "Brent?" She nodded once. He handed her the lantern. "Blow it out." The light vanished, plunging the ranch into a thick, eerie half-dark. Only the silver wash of moonlight remained. Caleb crouched, checking his shotgun, then motioned toward the porch. "Wake the others." Quiet. Lozen slipped away, bare feet soundless on the wood. Moments later, Naira appeared in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, eyes wide but steady. "He's here?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "And he's not alone." From beyond the fence came Brent's voice, oily and mocking. "Evening Morton, got something belongs to me." Caleb stepped into the yard, shotgun leveled but not yet raised. "You're trespassing." Brent laughed, low and mean. "So were they, when you picked him up off the dirt. Ain't that right?" Behind him, one of the men muttered, "We could end this quick." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Turn around, Brent. Ride home while you still got legs." "Not without what's mine." Brent's voice cracked with rage. "Hand the girls over. I'll leave you breathing." A door creaked behind Caleb. He didn't look back, but he knew the women were watching. He felt their fear, the kind he'd seen before in soldiers' eyes, when dying felt easier than standing. He took one step forward. "You step closer, and we find out who leaves here breathing." The silence that followed was the kind that comes right before lightning strikes. Brent moved first. He lunged, the knife flashing under the moon. Caleb swung the butt of his shotgun, catching him across the ribs. The blade sliced through Caleb's sleeve, drawing blood, but he didn't flinch. Gunfire cracked. One of Brent's men fired too soon. The shot missed, splintering the porch beam. Inside, Sahana screamed. Lozen darted from the doorway, snatching the rifle from where it hung by the window. With steady aim, she fired into the air, one sharp blast that echoed through the valley like thunder. "Neighbors'll hear," she hissed. Brent cursed, swinging again, but Caleb caught his wrist, twisted hard. The knife clattered to the dirt. "You picked the wrong ghost to haunt," Caleb growled. The second man charged with the rope, but Tiva burst from behind the wagon, throwing a bucket of hot ash straight into his face. He howled, stumbling backward. Ahioka yanked the rope from his hands, tripping him clean into the trough. Brent tried to pull free, but Caleb slammed him against the fence post, pinning him there. For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes, hate against exhaustion, cruelty against conviction. Then came the sound of hooves, distant, growing. Neighbors. Sheriff's comin', Lozen shouted. Brent spat blood. This ain't over, he hissed. Caleb's grip tightened. It's over tonight. He tore a length of rope from the fence, bound Brent's hands behind his back, and shoved him to his knees. The ranch yard filled with light as lanterns approached from across the fields. The sheriff's voice boomed through the dark. What in hell's going on here? Caleb looked down at Brent, breathing hard. Just taking out the trash. When the lawman reached them, the fight was done. Brent was dragged off cursing, his threats scattering into the wind like dust. Caleb stood in the doorway, blood seeping through his sleeve, eyes dark and quiet. Behind him, Naira whispered, "You could have let them take us." He turned to her, weary but certain. "Not my style." Outside, the wind had stilled. The night was silent again, not the silence of fear, but the deep, clean hush that follows when a man's ghosts finally stop whispering. The moon sat high and cold over Silver Creek Ranch, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The world seemed to hold its breath, even the wind dared not move. Only the creak of the fence and the rasp of Caleb Morton's own breathing broke the stillness. He could still feel the sting of the knife, where Brent's blade had grazed his arm. Blood soaked through his sleeve, warm and steady. But pain was nothing new. What mattered now was keeping those women alive. "Stay inside," he barked, voice rough. "Lock the door. No one leaves till I say." But Naira shook her head from the porch. "You can't fight them alone." "I've done worse," Caleb muttered. Lozen stepped up beside Naira, loading the rifle she'd taken earlier. "You won't have to." He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. The look in her eyes was the same one he'd seen in soldiers who'd already buried too many friends to turn back. There was no stopping her. Beyond the fence, Brent Holloway staggered to his feet, face slick with blood and dust. Two of his hired men regrouped beside the barn, one with a shotgun, the other clutching a knife. The law was still half a mile away, maybe more. If they meant to finish it, it had to be now. "Spread out," Caleb said, voice low but sure. "Keep the fire behind you. Don't give 'em a clean shot." The yard burst into chaos. The first man fired toward the porch, the bullet shattering the window where Naira had stood seconds before. Glass rained down, glittering in the moonlight. Lozen returned fire, steady and calm, hitting the man square in the shoulder. He dropped his gun, screaming. Ahioka, small but fierce, darted from the doorway with a lantern in hand. She swung it hard, sending burning oil splattering across the wagon. Flames leapt up, cutting the yard in half with a wall of orange. Brent cursed, eyes wild. "You think this changes anything, Morton?" Caleb stepped from the smoke, rifle in hand. "It changes how fast you fall." The two men met in the center of the yard, the old rancher and the man who'd never known mercy. Brent lunged with his knife. Caleb parried with the rifle's barrel, using it like a staff. Steel clanged against steel. Sparks flew. Lozen shouted, "Behind you!" The second attacker charged from the side, rope raised. Before he could swing, Tiva rushed forward with a shovel, striking him across the knees. The man fell hard, gasping. Sahana grabbed a wooden pole from the fence and helped pin him down while Ahioka tied his wrists. The smell of gunpowder, fire, and fear thickened the air. Caleb and Brent circled each other like wolves. Brent slashed again, the blade catching Caleb's shoulder. He grunted but didn't retreat. "You talk about owning people," Caleb spat, "but you never owned a damn thing worth keeping." With a roar, he drove forward, knocking the knife from Brent's hand. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. Caleb swung the rifle's butt, cracking it across Brent's jaw. The man fell to his knees, blood spilling down his chin. "You think you're some kind of savior?" Brent gasped, choking. "No," Caleb said. "Just a man who's done being a coward." He looped the rope around Brent's wrists and pulled it tight, the fibers biting deep. The fight was over. From the distance came the faint thunder of hooves, the sheriff and a handful of neighbors riding fast, lanterns swinging. Their light flickered against the smoke rising from the yard. When they arrived, they found Brent bound and beaten, his men groaning in the dirt. The sheriff dismounted, looking from the captives to Caleb's bleeding arm. "Hell of a night you had, Morton." Caleb's voice was flat. "Just cleaning up my land." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Good work keeping her safe." As Brent was dragged toward the wagon, he twisted his head, spitting blood. "You think this is the end?" he rasped. "There'll be others. Always are." Caleb didn't answer. He just turned away, staring at the women gathered in the doorway, bruised, trembling, but alive. The firelight danced across their faces, painting them with gold. When the last lantern disappeared down the road, the yard fell quiet again. Only the crackle of the burning wagon remained. Naira stepped forward, voice barely above the wind. "You could have let them take us." Caleb met her gaze, his face unreadable. "Not my style." For a long time, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Lozen set the rifle down. Ahioka poured water on the flames. The light dimmed, and the night exhaled. The desert was silent once more, but not empty. Inside the house, as Caleb finally sank into the chair by the fire, he realized something he hadn't in years. The ghosts were gone, chased away not by prayer, but by courage. Outside, the moon drifted west, pale and unblinking. Silver Creek Ranch still stood, and so did they. Dawn rose over Silver Creek Ranch, soft and gold after a night that had nearly ended in blood. Smoke still drifted above the yard where the wagon burned, but the air felt cleaner, almost forgiving. Caleb Morton sat on the porch, arm bandaged, the ache in his shoulder reminding him he was still alive. Inside, the women moved quietly, the scrape of pans, the rhythm of sweeping, the murmur of voices in Apache. The house that had once been hollow now breathed like a living thing. Naira stepped out, holding a cup of coffee. "You should rest," she said. Caleb took it, his fingers brushing hers. "Been resting for years." She smiled faintly. "You saved us." He shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just gave you a roof." The morning light spilled across the fences, catching on the wet ground. Lozen hammered the barn door back into place. Sahana hung fresh linens. Ahioka tended the fire. Tiva hummed while chasing a chicken through the dust. Naira looked toward the horizon. "The ghosts are gone," she said softly. Caleb's gaze followed hers. Maybe they finally found peace. A breeze swept through the valley, carrying the smell of sage and new earth. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight on his chest ease, not because the past had vanished, but because life had dared to grow over it. He raised the cup to his lips, watching sunlight touch the hills. "The house is warm again," he murmured. And this time, the wind didn't sound lonely. A week passed before the land settled back into calm. The fences were fixed, the barn patched, and the laughter of 5 Apache women became part of the wind that rolled across Silver Creek Valley. One morning, Caleb hitched the wagon and said quietly, "There's something you all should see." They rode for miles until the trail opened to the place where he'd first found them, the dried riverbed now glowing under sunlight. The sand was smooth again, the footprints long erased. The women stood in silence. Naira knelt, scooping a handful of dust, letting it fall through her fingers. "This is where we died," she whispered, "and where we began again." Caleb nodded, eyes on the horizon. "This place took everything from me once," he said, voice rough, "but it gave me back what I'd lost." Lozen pressed a small charm of feathers and beads into the ground. "For the ones who didn't make it," she said softly. They stayed there for a long time, saying nothing. The wind moved through the grass, gentle, almost kind. When they finally turned back toward the wagon, Caleb looked over his shoulder one last time. "Guess we can stop running now," he murmured. Naira met his gaze, her smile warm beneath the wide desert sky. "We stopped the day you found us." As they rode home, the sun sank low behind the hills, painting the valley gold. The ranch waited not as a refuge, but as a promise that some wounds could, at last, learn how to heal. Autumn came quietly to Silver Creek Ranch. The days grew shorter, the air cooler, and the fields shimmered gold under the fading Sunday. Yet inside the old house, warmth lingered not from the fire, but from laughter, footsteps, and the scent of bread rising in the oven. Caleb Morton stood by the window, watching Lozen and Tiva mend a fence while Ahioka and Sahana hung herbs to dry. Near the well, Naira was teaching a colt to trust her hand. The ranch no longer looked lonely. It looked alive. He stepped outside, his shadow long across the dirt. "You've turned this place upside down," he said with a half-smile. Naira glanced at him, wiping dust from her palms. "No," she replied softly. "We just helped you remember how to live." They stood together, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The valley glowed like fire, the same light that had once witnessed despair now warming 6 souls who refused to give up. Caleb spoke quietly, as if to himself. "I thought this land was cursed. Turns out, it just needed people brave enough to stay." Naira's eyes softened. "Then let's keep staying." He nodded, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. "Yeah," he said, "let's." As darkness settled, the lamps flickered to life, and smoke rose gently from the chimney, a signal to the world that life still burned here. Out in the wide silence of the desert, Silver Creek Ranch no longer stood as a memory of loss, but as proof of survival of a man and 5 women who chose hope over ghosts. And that flame would never go out. The story of Caleb Morton and the 5 Apache widows isn't about heroism, it's about endurance. It's about people who had every reason to give up, yet somehow found the strength to stay. Out in the desert, where mercy is rare and hope costs more than gold, they built something the world had taken from them: trust. They didn't save each other out of duty, they did it because, deep down, every broken soul still wants to be seen, still wants to be believed in. Maybe that's the lesson of Silver Creek Ranch. That family isn't always blood, and home isn't always where you're born sometimes. It's where you're finally forgiven. So if this story reached you tonight, partner, take a breath, look around your own life. There's always someone out there worth saving, and maybe, in saving them, you'll save a part of yourself too. If you'd like to keep riding with us through these Wild West nights, hit subscribe, share this story, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. The fire's still burning here at Silver Creek, and another story's waiting beyond the next sunrise.